Berlin, Reich Air Ministry, May 16, 1940. The laughter started with Udet. General Lieutenant Ernst Udet set the telegram on the conference table with the careful deliberation of a man who wants the room to notice what he is about to say. He was short, broad-shouldered, with the ruddy complexion of someone who had spent too many years celebrating victories he had not quite earned. "Gentlemen," he said, "the Americans would like to build 50,000 airplanes." The room took a moment. Then General der Flieger Hans Jeschenek pressed two fingers against his temple as though fighting a headache brought on by sheer absurdity. Field Marshal Erhard Milch allowed himself the smallest of smiles, the smile of a man who has just been told something so obviously wrong that correcting it feels beneath him. "Per year?" asked Jeschenek. "Per year," confirmed Udet. Someone near the window laughed out loud, a sharp, involuntary sound. The telegram had arrived through ordinary diplomatic channels as though it carried ordinary news. President Roosevelt had stood before Congress and declared, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never assembled anything more complex than a fishing rod, that the United States intended to produce 50,000 military aircraft annually. 50,000. Germany, at the height of its mobilization, was producing fewer than 9,000 aircraft per year. Britain, exhausted and bleeding, was managing somewhere between 12 and 15,000, with every factory running double shifts. The combined output of the two greatest aviation powers in Europe did not approach Roosevelt's number. Udet picked up the telegram again. He also mentioned tanks, artillery, and ships in proportions I won't bother reading aloud, he said. I suspect we would all require a rest afterward. More laughter, the kind that settles the nerves. Milch did not laugh. He studied the telegram with the expression of a man who has found a loose thread in an otherwise perfect garment. Not alarmed, but attentive. Of everyone in that room, Milch understood production. He had rebuilt the Luftwaffe from a shadow organization into the most powerful air force on Earth through the unglamorous machinery of procurement schedules and material allocations. He knew precisely what it took to produce an aircraft, the tooling, the trained labor, the supply chains stretching back through aluminum smelters and precision instrument workshops. He also knew something the others had already forgotten. This was not the first time his office had received accurate intelligence about American industrial capacity. General Friedrich von Bottker, the German military attaché in Washington, had been sending reports to Berlin for nearly 2 years. His cables were precise and deeply uncomfortable to read. American automobile factories in Michigan and Ohio were already receiving preliminary contracts. Engineers from Curtiss and Douglas were visiting Ford and General Motors plants, asking quiet questions about retooling timelines. Von Bottker had used the word unvorstellbar, unimaginable, not to dismiss what he was seeing, but to warn that the scale of American productive potential was genuinely beyond European reference. His reports had been read, filed, and politely ignored. Göring entered 12 minutes late, still adjusting the medals on his white dress uniform, trailing the faint scent of French perfume he had acquired since the fall of Paris. Someone handed him the telegram. He read it, and his broad face arranged itself into an expression of theatrical disbelief. 50,000, he said, the way one repeats a joke to make sure everyone has heard it. Roosevelt needs 50,000 aircraft? He set the telegram down. Does he also need a miracle, or will the 50,000 be sufficient? The room laughed again, louder this time. Udet leaned back in his chair with the comfortable authority of a man returning to an argument he has already won. They build automobiles, he said. Very good automobiles, I grant them that. But you cannot take an assembly line that builds a Ford motor car and instruct it to produce a fighter. The tolerances alone would destroy them. Their workers have never seen an aircraft engine. Their managers have never run an aircraft plant. He was not wrong about any of this. In May of 1940, everything Udet said was factually correct. American aircraft production was embryonic. The factories were small, the workforce untrained, the supply chains non-existent. If you measured the distance between where America stood and where Roosevelt's number required them to be, the gap was not merely large, it was categorical. What Udet could not see was that the distance did not matter. What mattered was the direction of travel, and the engine doing the traveling. The telegram was set aside. The meeting moved on to other matters. France was collapsing. Britain would be next. The war was proceeding exactly as planned. No one noticed that Milch had read the telegram 3 times. No one asked what arithmetic he was running silently in his head. Arithmetic that would not resolve into a comfortable answer no matter how many times he ran it. Outside, Berlin moved in its afternoon rhythms. Trams ran on schedule. The flags of the Reich hung motionless in the windless May air. The laughter faded into the marble corridors and was forgotten. No one thought to ask what would happen if the Americans were serious. Washington, D.C., the White House, May 16, 1940. The applause in the chamber had barely faded when William Knudsen folded the printed copy of Roosevelt's speech and slid it into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He did not applaud. He was already thinking. Knudsen was 51 years old, broad as a draft horse, with hands that looked as though they had been borrowed from a larger man. He had been born Signius Wilhelm Pohl Knudsen in Copenhagen, arrived in America at the age of 20 with $40 and no English, and had risen through the Ford Motor Company by the simple method of understanding machines better than anyone around him. Henry Ford had eventually made him a production chief. General Motors had made him president. He had left a salary of $300,000 annually to work for Roosevelt at $1 per year because someone had asked him to, and because he was constitutionally incapable of declining a problem that interested him. 50,000 aircraft interested him enormously. Outside the chamber, a reporter caught his arm. "Mr. Knudsen, do you believe the president's number is achievable?" Knudsen looked at the man with the patient expression of an engineer confronted with a question that has only one honest answer. "I believe," he said carefully, "that we have not yet tried." He climbed into the waiting automobile and said nothing further for the entire drive back to the office. His aide, a young man from Ohio named Carlton Briggs, who had learned to read Knudsen's silences the way a sailor reads weather, understood that the thinking had already begun. The problem, as Knudsen understood it, was not ambition. Roosevelt had ambition in quantities that exceeded any reasonable industrial requirement. The problem was conversion, the specific, grinding, technically demanding process of taking an economy built around peacetime production and teaching it an entirely different language. America in May of 1940 manufactured automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, and farm equipment with breathtaking efficiency. It manufactured military aircraft with the hesitant, small-batch precision of a cottage industry that had never been asked to grow up. The numbers were unsparing. In 1939, American factories had produced 3,611 military aircraft. The Army Air Corps possessed fewer than 2,000 combat-ready machines, many of them designs that the Royal Air Force had already quietly retired. The entire American aviation industry employed perhaps 90,000 people. A single large automobile plant in Michigan employed more. But Knudsen had spent 30 years inside automobile plants, and he knew something about them that the generals in Berlin did not. An automobile was not simpler than an aircraft, not in the ways that actually mattered for mass production. A modern motor car contained thousands of precision components, manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, assembled on moving lines by workers who had learned their tasks through repetition until the movements became involuntary. The infrastructure for doing this at scale, the machine tools, the quality control systems, the logistics networks, the trained supervisory workforce, all of it already existed. It was pointed at the wrong product, but it existed. The question was not whether America could build 50,000 aircraft. The question was how long it would take to turn the machine around. Knudsen spent the following week in Detroit. He visited Ford's River Rouge complex, which at full capacity could process raw iron ore at one end and produce a complete automobile at the other in a cycle of 28 hours. He walked through the Chrysler tank plant taking shape in Warren. He sat in conference rooms with production engineers from Packard, from Pratt & Whitney, from Curtiss-Wright, and he asked each of them the same question. Not whether they could build engines and airframes, but how quickly they could learn to build them in numbers that had never been attempted. The answers were cautious. The engineers were honest men, and honest men do not promise what they cannot calculate. But beneath the caution, Knudsen heard something he recognized: the particular quality of attention that engineers give to a problem they find genuinely interesting. These men were not frightened by the scale of the challenge. They were engaged by it. He returned to Washington and wrote a single page of notes, which he kept. The page contained no rhetoric and no patriotism and no reference to the war in Europe. It contained production estimates, conversion timelines, and a list of bottlenecks in the order he intended to address them. At the top of the page, underlined twice, were the words, "The distance is large, the direction is correct, begin." Roosevelt received him 3 days later. The president was in good spirits, as he generally was when discussing large ambitions. He asked Knudsen whether 50,000 was the right number. Knudsen considered the question. "It may be," he said, "a conservative estimate." Roosevelt smiled. He had chosen his man correctly. Across the Atlantic, in the marble corridors of the Reich Air Ministry, the telegram had reached its final destination. A filing cabinet on the 3rd floor, in a drawer labeled with the bureaucratic patience of an institution that believed it had already won. It would remain there, undisturbed, while the answer to its contents was being assembled, one rivet at a time, in the automobile plants of Michigan. The laughing generals had not been listening. The quiet Dane had not stopped counting. Willow Run, Michigan, April 18, 1941. The field was empty when Charles Sorensen first walked it. He stood at the edge of what had been farmland the previous autumn, flat, unremarkable Michigan earth, still soft from the spring thaw, smelling of mud and last year's corn stubble. Behind him, a Ford Company car idled on the gravel road. Ahead of him, stretching to the tree line a half-mile distant, was nothing. Precisely, deliberately, magnificently nothing. Sorensen was 60 years old, lean and angular, with the unsentimental bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades inside Ford Motor Company, solving problems that other people had declared unsolvable. He had been Henry Ford's production chief, his enforcer, his instrument. Workers called him Cast Iron Charlie, not affectionately, but accurately. He did not traffic in sentiment, he trafficked in output. He looked at the empty field for a long time. Then he turned to the young engineer standing beside him, a man named Logan Miller who had driven up from Dearborn that morning with a rolled set of preliminary drawings under his arm. "How long," Sorensen said, "to break ground?" Miller blinked. "Sir, we haven't finalized the—" "How long?" 3 weeks if we mobilize immediately." 2, said Sorensen. He walked back to the car. The building that would rise from that empty Michigan field over the following months would become, when completed, the largest factory under a single roof in the history of human construction. 3.5 million square feet, an assembly line stretching 1 full mile in length, bending at a right angle near its midpoint, because Sorensen had refused to acquire the additional farmland that a straight line would have required. A decision that would cause engineers considerable grief and earn the building its distinctive L-shaped footprint visible from the air. 40,000 workers would eventually labor inside it across 3 shifts, around the clock, every day of the year. The aircraft it was built to produce was the consolidated B-24 Liberator, a four-engine heavy bomber of considerable complexity. The B-24 contained 488,193 individual parts. Its fuel system alone required more than a mile of tubing. Its electrical wiring, laid end-to-end, would have stretched from Willow Run to downtown Chicago. Sorensen had promised Henry Ford, and Ford had promised the Army Air Corps, one B-24 every single hour. The Consolidated Aircraft Plant in San Diego, which had designed the B-24 and was currently the only facility producing it, required one full day to complete a single aircraft. Sorensen was proposing to do in 60 minutes what San Diego did in 24 hours. The Army Air Corps procurement officers who received this commitment responded with the carefully neutral expressions of men who have been told something they cannot politely contradict. The first months justified every skepticism. The fundamental problem was one that Sorensen had anticipated intellectually, but that proved, in practice, considerably more savage than any blueprint suggested. An automobile is designed to be manufactured. Every component, every assembly sequence, every tolerance specification in a Ford motor car had been developed with the production line in mind, shaped by decades of accumulated knowledge about what a moving assembly line can and cannot do. The B-24 had been designed by aeronautical engineers whose primary concern was that it fly correctly, not that it assemble quickly. The result was an aircraft of genuine capability and genuine manufacturing complexity, full of components that required hand-fitting, sequences that resisted automation, and tolerances that demanded skills the automotive workforce did not yet possess. By the autumn of 1941, Willow Run had produced exactly 0 completed bombers. The press, which had arrived in considerable numbers to witness the miracle of American industrial mobilization, began asking questions that grew less polite with each visit. One columnist renamed the facility "Will It Run?", a joke that spread through Washington with the speed and enthusiasm of something that is funny precisely because it is also true. The Army Air Corps quietly began hedging its production forecasts. Congressional committees requested briefings. Sorensen ignored all of it with the focused contempt of a man who considers public attention a distraction from public results. He walked the assembly line every morning at 5 o'clock before the day shift arrived in the vast and echoing silence of the unfinished building. He stopped at each station where the work had stalled and asked the same question he had asked in that muddy field the previous spring. Not why it could not be done, but how long until it was. He broke the B-24 into subassemblies, discrete modules that could be built simultaneously in different sections of the plant and brought together at the final line. He commissioned hydraulic riveting tools that reduced the physical demand on workers and increased both speed and consistency. He developed prefabricated wiring harnesses that transformed a multi-hour hand-laying operation into a 30-minute installation. He absorbed 578 design changes from Consolidated in 1942 alone, each one a disruption, each one accommodated without stopping the line, because the alternative was producing an aircraft that the combat crews would fly into battle with known deficiencies. The first completed B-24 rolled out of Willow Run in September of 1942. It required complete rebuilding before it could be accepted by the Army Air Corps. The second and third had similar problems. Quality control failures ran at rates that would have been unacceptable in any peacetime industry. But the line was moving. However slowly, however imperfectly, the line was moving. And Sorensen, walking the floor at 5 in the morning with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes moving from station to station, was already seeing something that the newspaper columnists and the congressional committees and the procurement officers could not yet see. He was seeing the rate of improvement, not the current output, the trajectory. The curve that begins shallow and then, when the variables align, turns sharply upward. He had seen that curve before. He knew what came after it. He said nothing about this to anyone. He simply came back the next morning at 5 o'clock, and the morning after that, and walked the line again. Berlin, Reich Air Ministry, October 1942. The report was 43 pages long. It had been compiled by Luftwaffe Foreign Intelligence over 6 weeks, drawing on neutral diplomatic cables, Swedish business contacts, and German agents operating under commercial cover in the United States. The title was dry: Assessment of American Aviation Industrial Capacity, Third Quarter, 1942. The contents were not dry at all. Field Marshal Erhard Milch read it alone on a Tuesday afternoon. He read it twice. Then he set it face down on his desk and sat with his hands flat on the leather surface, looking at nothing. The report described Willow Run. It described 3.5 million square feet, a number Milch recalculated twice because his first reading seemed impossible. It described the workforce being assembled, the sub-assembly system, the tooling investments. It noted, with the careful hedging of analysts reporting something their superiors would find unwelcome, that current output remained low and quality control remained problematic. It then noted, in the same careful language, that the rate of improvement was accelerating. The projection at the report's end was specific. By the second quarter of 1944, Willow Run alone, one factory, on farmland that had been empty fields 3 years earlier, might produce between 300 and 400 heavy bombers per month. Milch read that projection 3 times. Each time, the number refused to become smaller. Germany's entire aircraft production in October of 1942 ran at approximately 1,000 machines per month. Fighters, bombers, trainers, all types combined. A single American factory was projected to produce, within 18 months, nearly half that number in heavy bombers alone. And Willow Run was not the only factory being built. Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in Long Beach, North American in Inglewood, each expanding, each accelerating. He summoned his production chief and showed him the projection without comment. The man studied it for a long moment. "These are American numbers," he said finally. "They tend toward optimism." "Discount them by 30%, Milch said. "Then tell me what you think." The production chief discounted them by 30%. He looked at the result. He said nothing. The Reich Marshal was not interested in the report. Göring received Milch's summary the following week and responded with the combination of dismissal and irritation that had become his characteristic posture toward unwelcome information. American production figures were exaggerated, he said. American quality was inferior. The workers were untrained, the designs mediocre, and the logistical challenge of moving aircraft across an ocean would neutralize whatever the factories managed to produce. He was not entirely wrong about the current moment. In October of 1942, American quality was still inconsistent. The bombers coming off Willow Run required rework. The crews flying them were inexperienced. But Milch understood something that Göring's confidence obscured. The Americans were not being judged on where they stood. They were being judged on where they were going. And where they were going, the trajectory, the rate of improvement the report had traced in its careful language, pointed toward a place that German production could not follow. Because Germany was not improving at the same rate. Germany was approaching its ceiling. The workforce was finite. The aluminum supply was constrained. The factory floor space was limited by geography and by the growing attentions of the Royal Air Force, which had developed an increasing interest in visiting German industrial centers at night. America had none of these constraints. America had a continent, and its workforce was still learning, which meant it was still improving. Milch noted in his private diary that evening, "The Americans are serious. We have not yet decided to believe it." Outside his window, Berlin prepared for winter. The streets were orderly. The newspapers reported victories. The report sat in its folder, patient and indifferent, waiting to be proven correct. Long Beach, California, Douglas Aircraft Plant, March 1942. Mary Cowell had never held a rivet gun in her life. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher from Pasadena, with 2 years of junior college behind her and 3 years of keeping books for a dry goods store on Colorado Boulevard. She had applied to Douglas Aircraft on a Thursday morning in February, standing in a line that stretched around the block and halfway down the adjacent street. Women mostly, a few older men, all of them holding the same printed notice the company had placed in the Los Angeles papers. War work, good wages, training provided. The personnel officer who interviewed her asked 2 questions. Could she follow written instructions? Could she work a night shift? She answered yes to both. He handed her a paper and told her to report Monday at 6 in the morning. She reported Monday at 6 in the morning. The plant floor hit her like a physical thing. The noise first, a wall of compressed air and metal and machinery that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. Then the smell. Cutting oil, aluminum dust, a faint sweetness from the sealant they painted on fuel tank seams. Then the scale. She had known, in the abstract way one knows things read in newspapers, that Douglas was building military aircraft. She had not understood, until she stood on that floor, what building military aircraft at scale actually looked like. The building stretched further than she could see clearly. Overhead, traveling cranes moved wing assemblies with the slow, deliberate grace of something very large that is being handled with great care. Along the floor, fuselage sections sat in jigs at intervals of perhaps 30 feet, each one surrounded by workers whose movements had the economical precision of people who have done the same task enough times that thinking is no longer required. Her trainer was a woman named Dolores Vasquez, 31, from East Los Angeles, who had been at Douglas for 4 months and moved through the plant with the proprietary confidence of someone who has earned her knowledge the hard way. Dolores handed Mary a pair of safety glasses, looked her over once, and said, "You'll hurt yourself twice before you stop hurting yourself. Everyone does. After that, it gets easier." The work was precise and physically demanding in ways that Mary had not anticipated. Riveting was not hammering. It required controlled pressure at exact angles, consistent timing, and understanding of how the metal behaved under stress. A rivet driven incorrectly had to be drilled out, which damaged the surrounding material and cost time that the production schedule did not have. Quality control inspectors walked the line continuously, and their authority was absolute. A failed inspection meant the work stopped until the problem was resolved, regardless of whose shift it was or how far behind the station had fallen. Mary drove her first acceptable rivet on her 4th day. Dolores marked it in her training log without ceremony. "Now do it 10,000 more times," she said, "and you'll be useful." What neither Mary nor Dolores nor any of the women on that line fully understood was that they were not simply filling positions vacated by men who had gone to war. They were, collectively and without anyone having planned it this way, improving the work. Women inspectors at Douglas reduced defect rates with a consistency that puzzled the male supervisors, until someone thought to measure the correlation between hand size and instrument access in confined airframe spaces. Smaller hands reached places that larger hands could not. Lighter pneumatic tools, redesigned to accommodate a smaller grip, turned out to be less fatiguing for everyone. Fatigue produced errors. Fewer errors produced better aircraft. By the autumn of 1942, Douglas Long Beach had 22,000 employees. More than half were women. The plant was producing aircraft at rates that its own management had considered optimistic 6 months earlier. Mary Cowell, by that autumn, was no longer on the rivet line. She had been moved to final inspection, the last checkpoint before an aircraft was accepted by the Army Air Corps. She walked through completed fuselages with a checklist and a flashlight, looking for the small failures that could become large ones at 30,000 feet. She found them. Regularly, methodically, without drama. Each one she found and flagged was an aircraft that went back for correction rather than forward to a crew that would fly it over enemy territory. She did not think of it in those terms. She thought of it as doing the job correctly. But the effect was the same. Somewhere over the Pacific and later over Europe, men flew an aircraft that came home because a woman in Long Beach with a flashlight and a checklist had been paying attention. Nordhausen, Germany. Mittelwerk Underground Factory. Winter 1943. The tunnel smelled of stone and fear. It had been carved into the Kohnstein mountain by prisoners of the SS, men transported from Buchenwald in sealed freight cars, given tools, and ordered to excavate. The work had begun in the autumn of 1943, with a desperation that the overseers made no effort to conceal. Above ground, Allied bombers were finding German factories with increasing regularity. The solution, as the Armaments Ministry saw it, was to move production underground, beyond the reach of any bomb yet built. The Mittelwerk complex would eventually stretch through nearly 2 miles of tunnel, divided into parallel galleries connected by cross passages at regular intervals. It would house the production lines for the V-2 ballistic missile and the V-1 flying bomb. It would employ at its peak 60,000 prisoners drawn from the concentration camp system, men from across occupied Europe, reduced by deliberate policy to the minimum physical condition consistent with continued labor. Anatol Veniger had been a toolmaker in Warsaw before the war. He was 36 years old, precise by training and temperament, with the particular mental discipline of a craftsman who understands that the difference between a good measurement and a bad one is not abstract. He had been in the camp system for 14 months when he arrived at Nordhausen, and he had survived those 14 months by the same method he had survived everything else, by paying close attention to what was actually happening around him, rather than what he was told was happening. What was actually happening at Mittelwerk was that the Germans were attempting to apply industrial production methods to a workforce that had been systematically deprived of the physical and psychological conditions that industrial production requires. Precision manufacturing demands concentration. It demands steady hands. It demands workers who can read a measurement, hold a tolerance, repeat a procedure identically across hundreds of iterations. It demands, at the most basic level, workers who have eaten enough to think clearly. The prisoners of Mittelwerk had not eaten enough to think clearly. They worked 12-hour shifts in tunnels where the temperature hovered just above freezing, under lighting that was adequate for moving through a space, but insufficient for fine work. The SS guards who supervised them understood violence, but not engineering. When a component failed inspection, the response was punishment, which produced fear, and fear produced more failures, and more failures produced more punishment. Veniger understood this dynamic with the cold clarity of a man who has learned to observe without appearing to observe. He understood something else as well. In a facility where the overseers could not themselves distinguish a correctly assembled component from an incorrectly assembled one, the definition of correct was, to a meaningful degree, whatever the prisoner doing the assembly said it was. He said nothing about this to anyone. He simply did his work with the outward appearance of compliance and the inward discipline of a man preserving something essential in himself against the pressure of an environment designed to eliminate it. The sabotage at Mittelwerk was never organized. There was no network, no coordination, no plan. It was the natural consequence of asking men who had been given every reason to resist to perform work that required their genuine cooperation. A tolerance held to the wrong dimension. A wiring connection made in a sequence that would pass visual inspection but fail under operational stress. Components that met the letter of the specification while violating its intent in ways that only became apparent at altitude, or at launch, or never, because the weapon simply failed to perform as designed. The German quality control system at Mittelwerk was not equipped to catch these failures. It was equipped to catch gross errors, missing components, obvious assembly mistakes, visible damage. The subtle failures, the ones that lived in the gap between what could be seen and what could be measured, moved through the line and into finished weapons. Meanwhile, in Long Beach, Mary Cowell walked through completed fuselages with a flashlight and found the things that should not be there. The contrast required no commentary. 2 production systems, 2 philosophies, 2 relationships between the people doing the work and the work being done. One system asked its workers for their best and received in return something that exceeded expectation. The other system demanded compliance through terror and received in return the minimum performance consistent with survival. And, wherever the darkness of the tunnels permitted, something considerably less than that. The aircraft coming off the Douglas Line in Long Beach flew. The weapons coming out of the Mittelwerk tunnels failed at rates that the SS recorded in reports that grew increasingly frustrated in tone as the months passed. Venegar survived the war. He was liberated in April of 1945, weighing 41 kilograms. He returned eventually to his trade. He never spoke publicly about what he had done in the tunnels, because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. The mountain at Nordhausen still stands. The tunnels are still there, if you know where to look. Berlin, Reich Air Ministry, February 1944. General Adolf Galland placed the report on Göring's desk without ceremony. He was 31 years old, lean and dark, with the particular composure of a man who has been in enough actual danger to find bureaucratic confrontation relatively manageable. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords at his throat. Decorations earned over Spain, over Britain, over France. In the cockpit of aircraft he had flown with a skill that was not in dispute by anyone on either side of the war. He was the general of the fighter arm, which meant he was responsible for the force that was supposed to protect Germany from what was now happening to Germany. The report contained numbers. Galland had prepared it himself because he did not trust anyone else to present them without softening them into something more comfortable than they were. Germany was losing 1,200 fighter aircraft per month. Production was replacing 1,000. The deficit was 200 machines every 30 days, a gap that compounded monthly, that could not be closed by optimism or by the Reichsmarshal's habitual insistence that the figures from the front were exaggerated. They were not exaggerated. America, the same report noted, was producing 2,500 fighters per month, losing 400. The arithmetic was not complicated. A schoolchild could follow it to its conclusion, and the conclusion was the same regardless of how many times you ran the numbers in search of a different answer. Göring read the report standing. This was unusual. He typically received briefings from the comfort of a large chair, with the physical authority of a very large man in an expensive uniform occupying a space that had been arranged for his comfort. Standing meant he was agitated, which meant the numbers had reached him despite his considerable defenses against unwelcome information. "These figures," he said, "reflect temporary conditions." Galland said nothing. He had learned, over 4 years of dealing with Göring, that silence was more effective than argument. Argument gave the Reichsmarschall something to push against. Silence left him alone with the numbers. "The new production programs," Göring continued, "will close this gap within—" "The new production programs," Galland said quietly, "are being bombed." This was the other piece of the report. The previous week, the 8th Air Force had launched what American planners were calling Big Week, 8 consecutive days of coordinated attacks against German aircraft production facilities. Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Brunswick, Leipzig. Targets that the Luftwaffe had defended at enormous cost the previous year, believing that the losses inflicted on unescorted American bombers would eventually make the campaign unsustainable. The bombers were no longer unescorted. Something had changed over German skies in the preceding months, and Galland had seen it himself from the cockpit and had not quite believed it until he had seen it twice more. The American fighters, the new ones, the long-nosed ones with the teardrop canopies, were not turning back at the German border. They were not turning back at all. They were appearing over Berlin, over Leipzig, over targets that had been considered beyond the range of any escort fighter, with fuel remaining for combat and the evident intention of using it. The P-51 Mustang had arrived in numbers, and it had arrived with drop tanks that extended its range beyond anything the pre-war physics of escort fighter design had suggested was possible. The line beyond which German fighters had waited in comfortable patience, the line that had made unescorted bombing so costly, no longer existed. Galland had reported this to Göring in December. Göring had told him his pilots were making excuses. Now the big weak figures were on the desk, and excuses were not among the variables. Göring set the report down. He walked to the window. Outside, Berlin moved in its winter rhythms, orderly and apparently permanent. He stood with his back to Galland for a long moment. "What do you need?" he said finally. It was the first time in Galland's memory that Göring had asked that question without already having decided the answer. "Time," Galland said, "which we do not have." Willow Run, Michigan, April 1944. The counter on the wall read 428. It was a simple thing. A wooden board with painted numerals, updated each morning by a foreman named Harold Briggs, who had been doing it since January of 1943, when the numbers had been embarrassingly small, and updating the board had felt more like confession than celebration. Now he changed the number every morning with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose patience has been vindicated by arithmetic. 428 B-24 liberators in a single month. One every 63 minutes, around the clock, every day. The promise that Charles Sorensen had made to the Army Air Corps in the spring of 1941, the promise that had been met with carefully neutral expressions from procurement officers who could not politely say what they actually thought, had been kept, and then exceeded. William Knudsen visited Willow Run that April. He walked the line in the early morning, before the day shift arrived, in the company of Sorensen and 2 Army Air Corps colonels who had flown in from Washington. He had walked this line many times over the preceding 3 years, and each time the experience had been different. First, the vast emptiness of a building not yet functioning. Then, the halting early production. Then, the gradual acceleration that the newspapers had missed because they were looking for drama rather than trajectory. Now there was no missing it. The line moved with the organic certainty of something that has found its natural rhythm. Subassemblies arrived at each station with the timing of a mechanism rather than a workforce. Wings from the west end of the building, tail sections from the north gallery, nose assemblies from the elevated platform above the final line. Workers moved around the emerging aircraft with the economical precision of people for whom the task had long since ceased to require conscious thought. The noise was enormous and constant and somehow reassuring. The way the noise of a healthy engine is reassuring to someone who knows what a sick one sounds like. Knudsen stopped at the final acceptance station, where a completed B-24 sat under the inspection lights, while 2 women with clipboards worked their way methodically through a checklist. He watched them for a while without speaking. One of the colonels leaned toward him. "Remarkable, isn't it?" the colonel said, meaning the aircraft. "Yes," said Knudsen. He was watching the women with the clipboards. The production figures for April 1944 told a story that would have been dismissed as fantasy 4 years earlier. Willow Run alone was producing more heavy bombers monthly than the Luftwaffe's intelligence section had projected for the entire American industry. Boeing in Seattle was delivering B-17 at rates that strained the Air Corps' ability to crew and deploy them. North American in Inglewood was producing 500 P-51 Mustangs every month, each one reliable, each one identical to the one before it, each one capable of flying to Berlin and back with fuel remaining for the return strafing run. The workers who built these machines were, by any pre-war measure, improbable. They were women who had been housewives. They were men who had been farmers, shopkeepers, school teachers. They were recent immigrants who spoke English as a second language and read assembly instructions with a dictionary beside them. They were teenagers who had left high school to take war jobs, and elderly men who had come out of retirement because someone had asked them to. None of them had any business, by the standards of 1939, building the most complex flying machines in the history of aviation. They built them anyway, and they built them well. Sorensen walked beside Knudsen without speaking, which was his preferred mode of communication in spaces where the work was doing the talking. At the far end of the line, a completed bomber was being towed toward the flight test apron, number 429 by the running count on the board. It moved slowly through the enormous doors into the pale Michigan morning, its 4 engines not yet running, pulled by a small tractor driven by a man in overalls who guided it with the casual ease of someone performing a routine task. Which it was. That was the point. It was routine now. Knudsen watched it go. He thought, briefly, of the empty field he had never actually seen. The field that Sorensen had walked in the spring of 1941, looking at nothing, already counting. He thought of the telegram in the filing cabinet in Berlin, and the laughter that had followed it, and the men who had laughed. He did not feel satisfaction, exactly. He felt the specific and sober emotion of a man who has watched an arithmetic problem resolve itself into the answer that the numbers always promised it would reach. 429. The doors closed behind the bomber. The line kept moving. Normandy, France, June 6, 1944. Göring received the first reports at 7:30 in the morning. He was at Weldenstein, his medieval castle in Bavaria, where he had been sleeping when the telephone calls began arriving in sequence, each one more definitive than the last, each one narrowing the space between possibility and fact. His aide brought the reports on a silver tray as though the manner of delivery might soften their content. It did not. The Allied invasion had landed on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. The airborne divisions had preceded it in darkness. The naval bombardment had begun before dawn. By the time Göring was reading the first assessments, American and British soldiers had been fighting on French soil for more than 2 hours. He dressed and went to the communications room. The numbers came in throughout the morning, and the numbers were the story. The Allied air forces had flown 11,590 sorties on the first day of the invasion. The Luftwaffe had managed 319, a ratio of 36-1. In the airspace above the most consequential military operation in the history of the Western world. Oberst-Lieutenant Josef Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, had requested permission to attack the beaches with his full strength. His full strength, after years of attrition and fuel shortages and the compounding mathematics of a production war that Germany had been losing for 18 months, consisted of 2 aircraft. He and his wingman had made a single strafing pass over Sword Beach at low altitude, under fire from every direction, and returned to their airfield having accomplished nothing that the invasion's outcome would record. 2 aircraft against an armada. Göring stood at the map table and looked at the coastline of Normandy, marked with the invasion symbols that his staff had placed there with the careful neutrality of professionals recording facts they would have preferred not to record. He had stood at map tables many times in this war, and looked at situations that required explanation or reframing or the application of the particular confidence he had always been able to summon when the room needed it. He could not summon it now, because the map did not show a tactical problem. It showed the result of a production calculation that had been running uninterrupted since May of 1940, since the afternoon in the Reich Air Ministry when a telegram had been passed around a conference table and the room had laughed. 4 years of American factories running 3 shifts. 4 years of women with clipboards and rivet guns. 4 years of Knudsen's arithmetic accumulating, compounding, resolving itself into the answer that it had always been going to reach. The answer was on the beaches of Normandy. 11,590 sorties. Enough aircraft to stack them from the sea surface to 30,000 feet and still have reserves. Enough aircraft to lose hundreds and replace them before the week was out. Enough aircraft to make the concept of German air defense over the invasion zone Not a tactical challenge, but a mathematical absurdity. One of his staff officers approached carefully. Herr Reichsmarschall, General Sperle requests guidance on— "Tell Sperle," Göring said, without looking up from the map, "that I will call him shortly." He did not call him shortly. He stood at the map for a long time, alone with the symbols and the numbers and the particular silence of a man who has run out of explanations. Outside the castle windows, the Bavarian morning was clear and bright. Somewhere to the northwest, beyond the visible horizon, the largest armada in history was unloading men and machines onto French beaches under an umbrella of aircraft that a single American factory in Michigan had contributed to building at the rate of one every 63 minutes. The laughter from 4 years ago was very quiet now, almost inaudible. Almost. Nuremberg, Palace of Justice, March 1946. The courtroom was cold in the mornings. Hermann Göring had learned to bring an extra layer beneath his uniform jacket, a small, private concession to physical discomfort that he would not have tolerated 4 years earlier, when discomfort was something that happened to other people. He sat in the defendant's dock with the composed attention of a man determined to perform dignity in circumstances designed to eliminate it. Major Kenneth Heckler had been interviewing him for 3 weeks. Heckler was 34, methodical, unimpressed by rank, with the patient persistence of someone who understands that the most revealing answers come not from confrontation, but from repetition, asking the same question in slightly different forms until the rehearsed answer wears thin and something honest appears beneath it. On a Tuesday morning in March, Heckler placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. It contained 2 numbers: American military aircraft produced during the war, 295,959. German military aircraft produced during the war, 94,677. Göring looked at the paper for a long time. Heckler said nothing. Outside, a cold rain moved across the Nuremberg rooftops. "I knew American industrial potential was considerable," Göring said finally. His voice had lost the theatrical resonance that had once filled rally grounds. It was the voice of an old man in a cold room. "I did not believe the execution would exceed my worst projections by this degree." Heckler waited. "That factory," Göring said. "Willow Run." He paused. "One factory. We had intelligence reports. I read them." Another pause. "I chose not to believe them." He looked at the numbers again. Then he set the paper down with the careful movement of a man placing something he no longer wishes to hold. "We declared war on an industrial civilization," he said, "and called it weakness." Heckler wrote this down. Göring said nothing further. The rain continued outside. The numbers on the paper did not change. They never had, and they never would. Because numbers do not revise themselves out of courtesy to the men who misread them. 4 years earlier, in a marble corridor in Berlin, the telegram had been filed away and the laughter had faded into the afternoon. The laughter was gone now. The numbers remained. They always do.